Cynthia Chris's conception of death of the author, wherein the limiting nature of auteur theory is rejected in favor of a more open, discursive analytical approach, is often conflated with the idea of art in a vacuum. While the specific identity of the author may not dictate their exact artistic decisions or intentions, all art contains the underlying influences, biases, and assumptions of the society and identities its creators were born into. Viewing films like Lost Highway in a vacuum, wherein the author's identity is a non-factor, creates, quote, a particular illusion of reality, end quote, where the influence of misogynistic norms are labeled intentional aspects of critique rather than unconscious bias. Lost Highway reflects the norms and context it was created in, as fundamentally, the, quote, world of the screen is subject to the law which produces it, end quote. Across many of David Lynch's neo-noir works, there is an obsessive fascination with the marks of male violence. The cinematography of Lost Highway captures this fascination through footage of violence, both sexual and non, within the film itself, serving as a kind of feminist meta-commentary on the human desire to capture and consume female objectification and violence from the safety of third-party observation. This commentary, however, is not free of the influence of the, quote, patriarchal unconscious, which Mulvey suggests underscores society. Although Renee, Lost Highway's first female lead, is presumed to be the film's femme fatale figure, established largely through her sexual agency, we learn little about her character before she is killed. When viewed through the tapes left at Renee and her partner Fred's house, Renee's appearances are as that of a sleeping form being consumed by an unknown voyeur and a dead body. Ultimately, Renee's initial presence within the film is solely as that of a body, in the most literal sense. The introduction of Alice as a secondary femme fatale figure further exemplifies the patriarchal unconscious which underscores Lost Highway. Alice's sexual agency aligns with the characterization of the femme fatale as both capable of claiming ownership by a powerful, antagonistic masculine figure, but also explicitly seeking to seduce the main figure of audience identification, Pete, into a life of crime. Beyond her narrative alignment with the femme fatale archetype, her portrayal through the camera itself reproduces the female fetishization Lost Highway could be argued to critique. Shots of Alice and Pete having sex are often positioned through dimly lit windows and behind corners, placing the viewer into the position of the voyeur. Pete's phone calls and recollections are contrasted between full shots of Pete and close-up shots of Alice's body and mouth, encouraging the audience to identify Alice as being characterized by her physicality. Alice, like Renee, exists only to bear the meaning and developments of her opposing male lead, with the camera itself reducing her character to nothing more than a body. Dorothy Valens, when viewed in a vacuum, is the embodiment of the neo-noir femme fatale. Despite her initial introduction as a jazz club singer, seducing the overly curious but ultimately innocent Jeffrey into a world of sexual deviance and criminality, her sexuality is tainted by violence and coercion. What initially appears to be a standard example of overt female sexuality, with Dorothy luring Jeffrey away from his primary love interest, the all-American girl-next-door archetype, is twisted into a commentary on men subjugating women to fulfill their own desires for power and control. While in a traditional noir film, the seductive and devious femme fatale is punished for using her sexuality to control the male figure, in the neo-noir, through the lens of postmodern analysis, the femme fatale's sexuality is a survival mechanism, which can be empowering or exchanged for clean, wholesome traditional femininity when she is no longer under threat. Mulvey's theory of the male gaze suggests that the format of film, and the women portrayed therein, is inherently aligned with the voyeuristic pleasure of scopophilia. The cinematography of Blue Velvet, when viewed through Mulvey's lens, seems to further justify this postmodern interpretation of Valens's masochistic desires and violent sexual engagements as a radical rejection of the objectified femme fatale. Rather than viewing, quote, the beauty of the woman as object, whose body, stylized and fragmented by close-ups, is the direct recipient of the spectator's look, end quote, Postmodern feminist analysis argues that by replacing the conservative linearity of classical Hollywood style with an ironic, surreal stylization, Lynch disallows images of sexuality and violence as a pleasurable spectatorial experience. Whatever pleasure the image of Dorothy Valens' body would ordinarily evoke is marred by discomfort, either due to the viewer's awareness of Frank's coercion and Freudian fascination with the sexual dynamics between parent and child, or Valens' clear mental instability when goading Jeffrey into hurting her during sex. When Jeffrey watches Dorothy from her closet, his initial voyeuristic pleasure at viewing her naked body is replaced with discomfort upon hearing her masochistic pleas and Frank's sexual deviance. The audience, like Jeffrey, is meant to be aware not only of their discomfort, but of the unusual absence of pleasure when confronted with the object of the female form. In a vacuum, this reading is perfectly acceptable. However, art exists within the context that it was created. The neo-noir's critical representation of the femme fatale, although suggesting, quote, the possibility of an active and ironic to-be-looked-at-ness, fundamentally depends on a conventional equation of women with sexual objectification and sexual objectification with women's power over men, end quote. Even in their attempts at defying the traditional male gaze, Lynch's representations of Dorothy Valens are rooted in the assumptions of a patriarchal society, impacting the audience's receptions of these representations as well. In revealing that Dorothy Valens' characterization as a sexually deviant, masochistic, seductive femme fatale was born out of coercion, Jeffrey, and thus the audience as well, can be absolved of any voyeuristic, sexually deviant urges. If Dorothy Valens' role as a femme fatale is an illusion, then any fetishization of the femme fatale must be illusory too. The intention of Lynch to critique the femme fatale character ultimately relies on the objectification of the female form just as much as any explicitly misogynistic portrayal of female sexuality. Regardless of slight adjustments made to the femme fatale archetype, quote, her function remains within the machinery of the patriarchal status quo. When the pale man wields a camera towards Pete near the end of Lost Highway, its lens is clearly a threat, appearing almost weapon-like. If the camera is in fact a weapon, we must ask who has been its victim throughout the film, and who has not. Is there any meaningful difference between the women portrayed solely as bodies on the mysterious tapes, and the women portrayed solely as bodies in Lost Highway itself? Lost Highway attempts to comment on the idea of being seen or captured as a form of objectification and violence, rejecting the fetishization associated with classical noir depictions of women, but fails to avoid objectifying its own femme fatale figures while doing so. Lynch may not have created these depictions with misogynistic intent, but ignoring the fact that the society he was raised in is deeply misogynistic, likely influencing his art, is fundamentally flawed. Ultimately, quote, feminism can never genuinely become postmodern. It grows out of a lived or real history of domination of women by men, a history postmodernism dissolves, end quote. Thus, any interpretation of Lost Highway, which does not account for the patriarchal unconscious, can only ever hope to justify the recreation of the objectified femme fatale. In Blue Velvet, Dorothy Valens is fetishized by the narrative itself, reproducing the objectification of the femme fatale just like with Renee and Alice. In the classic noir film, the femme fatale's character is that of a sexual object. Her sexuality exists to be consumed, regardless of whether it is used to empower or disempower. Finally, she is removed from a life of seduction either through punishment or reform, in order for the male subject to re-establish his power. Lynch's conception of the neo-noir is no different. Dorothy's true character is unknown for much of the film, replaced by the objectified image of the femme fatale and later the feminine mother. Her sexuality is consumed through voyeuristic pleasure by Jeffrey, in spite of its taboo nature, permitting the audience to do so as well. She is ultimately saved from a life of deviance and transformed into an object of acceptable, non-sexual feminine motherhood. In a society which assumes female sexual objectification is either done by men for the pleasure of scopophilic viewing, embodied by the audience and primary character of identification Jeffrey, or by women for the usurpation of control from men, embodied by Valens' initial introduction within the film, attempts to restructure these dynamics through a critical lens ultimately serve only to reproduce the ideal they attempt to critique. This problem is not limited to David Lynch, nor would I argue these portrayals were malicious. Regardless, ignoring the presence of patriarchal unconscious in the neo-noir conception of the femme fatale only serves to produce an incomplete understanding of the films themselves. The film noir conception of the femme fatale was born out of unconscious anxiety around female sexuality and agency in the wake of World War II. At the end of the day, the neo-noir conception of the femme fatale does not disprove this original archetype, but simply reshapes it to suit the slightly more subtle, but equally prominent unconscious misogynistic norms of contemporary society.